From the get-go, they had an ace that most others in the early 60s had not yet acquired. That was a firm grasp on the use and implementation of transistors. Interesting to note that another struggling young tech company which would play a role in the group's future, Sony at the time, also understood what semiconductors would mean in a very short span of time. This helped the group, along with Sony, to become dominant players in their respective industries. The difference is that Sony concentrated on customer goods, while Grass Valley concentrated on whatever their broadcasting customers wanted. This worked until it didn't. Sony made markets, and eventually their activities tripped up the group. One day, the third in a three-way television network revenue race in the early 60s came a-calling. RCA, the behemoth vendor of all things radio and TV at the time, couldn't deliver a piece of equipment that ABC needed for the 1964 Republican Convention. That piece of equipment was called a processing amplifier, or ProcAmp for short. They asked Doc Hare and the company if they could design and deliver one.
Well, he called me up and he said, now look, he said, if you can build us 10 processing amplifiers and 30 DAs, distribution amplifiers, in a month, I'll get you the order. And I said to him, what in hell is a processing amplifier?
That said, Hare and company, with their engineering prowess, had a working example and a case even in under 10 days. Needless to say, at the time, RCA was so dominant in broadcasting and high-end television production equipment that someone said, if RCA doesn't make it, we don't need it. That didn't stop the group from making inroads into RCA's and others' territories. RCA introduced this mammoth beast about the time GVG introduced the 1400. It used 2-inch wide videotape in a cartridge. Each cartridge held only 3 minutes of tape. Internally, it had two 800-pound tape decks. Soon the group became ABC's de facto engineering research facility. As mentioned earlier, that was good. Later on, not so much. The group eventually ended up with a 300-acre campus on Bitney Springs Road, northwest of town. The prominent building on the right as you entered the campus was Building 4. It was built in 1984. This building had most pieces of the company come through it over time. There is actually a Bitney Springs. It's right as you turn onto Bitney Springs Road as you leave town. Until the early 80s, Bitney Springs Road, the main route out to the campus, passed over the single one-lane bridge. Building 1 was the first building on the Bitney Springs campus. It burned down in 1977. Doc Hare built his house on a ridge above the group's campus. To the north, it had views of Mount Lassen, and to the southwest, it looked towards Sacramento. Building 9 was the last major building on the Bitney Springs campus. It was completed in 1992. To get around the spread-out campus, bikes were available outside each building. Young folks were hired during the warm months, which was most of them, to keep the bikes distributed throughout the campus. Hare always insisted that trees should be spared when new buildings were erected. Even though he lost a dog to a rattlesnake, Hare never wanted to see the destruction of anything in nature. The campus, including this building, now has different owners, as does the company. Over time, it had many. The main tenant today. A new site was started in the mid-'80s to handle company growth in the area. The Bitney Springs site at one time employed over 1,200. Bitney Springs was considered part of the town of Grass Valley. Now, for the first time, the company had a presence in neighboring Nevada City. Even after Tektronix had bought the company, it was still thought that the company would continue to grow in the area, and that one day, this sign would be true. But that never happened. Only 4 buildings were ever completed, and 2 of those were a maintenance building and a guard shack. The facility never employed more than 400 employees. Meanwhile, Bitney Springs was starting to be hollowed out. Why? The top 3 reasons that was happening. The county was becoming more stringent concerning environmental issues at the site. Forest fires. The top reason? The company was sold 6 times. Each time the area's relevance was increasingly diluted. Recently, the company was down to a single building in the area, while back in Grass Valley proper, it never housed much more than a couple hundred people. This final building was owned by the official spin-off from the company, and that company was also sold a few times. The last company to own it was merged with the group,